Welcome everyone, Questini here with a discussion about some of the biggest issues that Total War Warhammer 3 has at the moment. There are plenty of other issues that I would not consider necessarily as big, but they're certainly a major problem with the games, like the DLC practices that Creative Assembly has embraced, the DLC prices, for instance. But in terms of the game in itself, in terms of the gameplay quality of it, there are a lot of problems with it in isolation of those DLC practices and everything else that's happening in Creative Assembly at the moment. The first issue I want to talk about is the map, or specifically the map density. So the way the Immortal Empires map works at the moment is it's very clustered with settlements. And what this means when we're looking at this kind of map design is that regardless of where you are on the campaign map, you are, for the most part, like 90% of the time, you're roughly 2 turns away from a settlement at most. The vast majority of times, you're 1 turn away from reaching a settlement. Like let's say, for instance, you start in a settlement, then you can reach another settlement in the same turn. Now, the problem with this, as I'm looking over this map, the problem with this particular situation is you end up having a dynamic on the campaign map where settlement hopping is very much a thing. Now, the problem with this, there are several issues, and it's actually the root cause of a lot of issues that Warhammer 3 does have. One, it pushes you towards fighting a lot more sieges and settlement battles than you otherwise would. Yes, they have removed the minor settlement battles, but honestly, I consider that a band-aid fix, and it wasn't really that great of a fix either. But you will end up having to fight more sieges, you'll end up having to deal with more settlement garrisons. The problem with that is settlement garrisons right now, or settlements in general, the way they work in Warhammer 3, and this is the exception to the rule in the Total War series, but the way settlements work right now is any minor settlement will inflict staggering losses on the attacker. And this is not something that just affects the player. This is one of the things to point out about these issues. These kind of problems that you encounter as the player, guess who else is also having to deal with these issues, and it is affecting it in a significant way? The AI. Whereas you as the player always have the option of fighting a battle manually, in settlements the AI doesn't. So you might wonder why the AI may struggle building massive empires. Well, if the auto-resolve is against any attacker when it comes to these settlements, minor settlements or wall settlements, and on top of that, the settlements are very close to each other, then that ends up significantly reducing the AI's ability to expand quickly on the campaign map and build powerful empires. Furthermore, and I'm considering Legendary very hard difficulty for this purpose. I'm not considering normal or easy or anything like that, just Legendary very hard. Furthermore, it further creates racial imbalance on top of the racial imbalance issues that do exist in the game. Basically, it means that races like the Warriors of Chaos or the races like the Greenskins end up being dominant on the campaign map because they can easily take settlements. Now, the Greenskins don't necessarily have the best auto-resolve situation, but they have so many armies that it doesn't matter. And like, look at Grimgor. You think Grimgor is going to be stopped by a minor garrison? No. Grimgor takes a monumental effort to stop if you're the player, let alone the AI. And this is the problem that gets created in campaigns. Furthermore, because of the map density being what it is very difficult in many campaigns to go one province to without reaching another legendary lord. So minor factions end up being consequential. So on top of all the other issues the AI has, it's very difficult for some legendary lord to even get started because they're going to encounter another legendary lord that's going to be bigger and more dangerous than them. For instance, Greece very rarely achieves anything on the campaign map single Kugath simply because they've got Helm and Gorst who can wipe out both of them at the same time. And that is an issue in the campaign in its design. And hell, I mean, even if Greece survives Gorst, he's still got Grimgor to deal with and enjoy that. I've seen Grimgor multiple times. Like, the only one who can stop Grimgor, just as an example, in this situation is Kolic. He's the only one who can fight Grimgor to standstill as the Warriors Cast Legendary Lord, and Warriors Cast being one of the more powerful races. But if he doesn't end up in a war with Kolic, I've seen Grimgor conquer, like, the entire part of this area from the north to the south, all the way to the islands there. Yeah, that's a bit ridiculous, and it's not because of it's not just because of racial imbalance, auto-resolve, or anything like that. It's not because Grimgore is Grimgore. It's because the map is designed in such a way that heavily favors him, and heavily favors races that are built around making a lot of money through looting and sacking settlements, and it hurts races that rely more on building structures in the settlements, like the dwarves, because the dwarves don't have a great deal of post-battle loot. That's the first issue. The map in itself, and this is something I've really realized playing Shogun 2, again, playing the Old World mod in particular. Like, this is not just a question like, oh, previous Total Wars did it better. Warhammer 3 can do it better. Like, the Old World mod, it opened my eyes to this. Just how a different map design with spread out more settlements can lead to a far better campaign experience, better AI, and better racial balance just on the map design alone. So the map of Immortal Empires is just not that great. I feel like with Immortal Empires, considering its development, I don't know this for certain. I don't have sources within Creative Assembly. Maybe it was someone who is in Creative Assembly can let me know on this. But the way I'm looking at this map, it just feels like a significant portion of this campaign map was done as a rush job, because Immortal Empires was rushed out the gate because Realms of Chaos failed, player numbers were declining, so the DLC team, a lot of the people that were supposed to work on that ended up working on Immortal Empires. And they kind of just made this bland, boring map in a lot of ways. It's probably, like, it's a big map. It's got its moments, but it's kind of one of the worst maps that we've had in Warhammer game, in a Total War game, actually. It's huge, but this is the thing. Just because something is big does not make it good. I think there's a lot of people that obsess, like, oh, the map should have this many regions on it. My concern with that is, like, how good is the gameplay experience on the map, not how many fucking settlements or factions there are on that map. That's my issue. Like, when I see those kind of comments, or when I see people talking about, like, oh, this mod will do that and all that. No. What a mod should do, or what Creative Assembly should do, and what a mod should do, is improve the gameplay experience. And that's something Creative Assembly has failed, and that's, by the way, something a lot of mods do failed. That's the thing that sets Old World apart, is that it is exceptional from that perspective, that it genuinely improves the gameplay experience. Now, I wouldn't necessarily expect this issue to be fixed by Creative Assembly. Like, I consider it a miracle. Then again, we have, like, a couple of modders building a massive campaign map on their own based on Warhammer 1, taking Warhammer 1, making it vastly bigger, more regions, more factions, all that, and doing a great job. So I'm kind of getting to the point where I think Creative Assembly is running out of excuses, really. And it shows you what they could have done if they had decided to do things differently. Now, there are hard limits because of the engine. There are limits because of the AI. So there are certainly concerns with respect to that. That is certainly a problem. But this clustered map doesn't work all that great from my perspective. The second issue is the auto-resolve. Now, this is something I've talked about at length in other videos, but let's take a look at the situation here. So over here, low casualties, but I just ambushed them. So I got lucky, I ambushed them, Skaven being Skaven, right? If I auto-resolve this particular army, I take 256 casualties. Here's the thing, if I fought this battle manually, the only unit that would do any kind of damage would probably be the Boar Boys, maybe the Big Guns. Everything else would be easily enough dealt with minimal casualties. That's a problem. But as I mentioned already, you then have the issue. You then have this issue where you go to a settlement, and again, I lose a lot of casualties. And this army is significantly weaker than the army I just dealt. So settlements end up being real bottlenecks. Settlements end up being real bottlenecks in terms of any particular campaign for both you and the AI. These kind of issues, without resolve, don't just affect you as the player. They affect the AI as well. Remember that particular point, because it is a very relevant point that you shouldn't ignore, because it does affect how the AI is going to behave, what's going to be achieved. Now, what's the problem with auto-resolve? Well, it doesn't reflect the kind of real combat power that exists for either you or the AI. There are many, like, some people would say, oh, it's too easy, too generous to the player. I think it's bullshit to have that perspective. I also think it's bullshit to have the perspective that, oh, it's too punishing. Though I generally think it is too punishing when it comes to these kind of settlement garrisons. But outside of that, field battles, it's not a question of it being punishing or generous. The problem with the auto-resolve is the way it works. So the auto-resolve has no relation to an actual battle, because in an actual battle, Snitch on his own can annihilate entire armies, especially with his items, or he can put up a genuine fight against hordes of enemies, kill their lords, maybe even rout them on his own. Snitch with artillery certainly can wipe out entire armies. The problem is that kind of level of power is not reflected. What matters in auto-resolve far more so than anything else, leadership and armor. So you end up having a situation where units and armies and factions that have units with low armor end up doing far worse than factions with high level of armor, with the exception of obviously things like casualty replenishment. That's one of the problems with Dwarves, because they have the high level of armor, but they don't have the casualty replenishment to match it. And you end up in a severely imbalanced situation that makes the racial imbalance even worse. It's really something like the problems of this game are tied together. So you have the map tying in together with other issues. You have the auto-resolve tying in together with other issues and making things worse. So consider the Skaven, right? This army, the starring army that I have here, not only is it powerful enough to walk through both the field battle I had here and the garrison I just dealt with minimal casualties. In fact, the starting army I have can take this entire province with ease if I fight these manual battles. But because Skaven be Skaven and most of the units here have low armor, I end up taking significant damage. Furthermore, not only does it hurt factions with low levels of armor, both for you and AI, but on top of that, it also ends up hurting balanced armies. One of the reasons it's always better to focus on kind of doom stacks beyond it's easier to recruit, it's easier to maintain. The reason you don't necessarily want to have balanced armies between melee and ranged in particular is because if you have a couple of ranged units and a decent number of ranged units, it's the melee units that are going to end up hurting, taking significant more damage and auto-resolve. And then on top of that, you can also exploit the auto-resolve as a player in a significant way, because every army, and this is unique again to kind of like the Warhammer games really, when you auto-resolve a field battle, or you, like with the siege, okay, fair enough. If you win a siege in a manual battle, you would wipe out any defender. But if you auto-resolve a field battle, then you will eliminate the enemy army. They will not retreat, they will not exploit. It doesn't matter if half the enemy army might have walked off the field if you were manually fighting them. If you just auto-resolve them, they all get wiped out. And this creates a situation, this is the perverse situation that you have in Warhammer 3, that sieges are horrible battles in this game, and you don't really want to deal with them manually, but field battles are the more interesting battles to fight. But because of the auto-resolve, if you can, it is easier and better to actually auto-resolve field battles, including legendary lords, because you can wipe them out. They won't leave unless they're vampire cons, and even then, right? Even then, they will walk away with only a handful of units if you auto-resolve it. Whereas if you fight them manually, half the army might escape, and you might end up in a situation where you can't win against the next battle. So if you can auto-resolve a battle and take minimal casualties and keep all your units alive, then that ends up being a substantially better situation for you as a player. So it's a system that leads to a bad gameplay experience, and it's completely divorced from the way things are handled in battles. I would like to point out, having been playing quite a bit of Shogun 2 recently, and not just Shogun 2, but in Shogun 2, if you auto-resolve a field battle, the AI can walk away from that. They'll take a lot of losses, but so will you. And that's the difference. Now I understand why Creative Assembly did it like this, because you end up having situations where the AI just runs away, and it is annoying, that kind of behavior from the AI that you end up seeing where the armies are running away, and you want to pin them down and destroy them. That's the reason behind that decision, to make it so when you are auto-resolving a field battle, the enemy army gets destroyed completely. I understand that, but it has the side effect of this, combined with the way the balance works in auto-resolve, combined with the fact that any settlement garrison, even in tier 1-1, can inflict severe damage, more so than a field battle would, on an army, leads to a situation that isn't conducive towards a great gameplay experience. Now, I understand, as I stated, I understand Creative Assembly's decisions. With regards to settlements, I think the reason auto-resolve is hurting you more is because the way the auto-resolve is made for settlements, it's made to account for the towers and the layout. Though in reality, fun fact, I might add like sieges and those kind of minor settlement battles were some of the easiest. If you're the attacker, they're horrible to defend, but they're easy to take. That's the thing. Like unless you're playing some very specific factions on some specific maps, like chaos maps actually are quite punishing if you're dealing with them. Like the Chaos Wasteland situation, that can be quite punishing if you're fighting manual battles in those settlements. But outside of those kind of settlement maps, many times when we're talking about the auto-resolve, the vast majority of times, the way it works in settlement battles and versus auto-resolve, like settlement battles, if you're having to deal with the layout of settlements, would actually be very, very easy. Because you're fighting, the reason they're easier, the reason sieges and settlement battles can be significantly easier is because the AI will not throw their entire army against you. Whereas in a field battle, they will try and throw their entire army against you. So you being able to defeat portions of the army one at a time makes the battle a cakewalk. A very boring cakewalk, I should point out, but still. The third issue with regards to Warhammer 3 is with the sieges. Now, sieges have been a problem in Total War really ever since the series has been launched, and I don't think Creative Assembly has really done them very well, with the exception of Shogun 2, but as the exception not the rule. And to be clear, it's not like Shogun 2 sieges were perfect. They still had a number of issues, but they were the best sieges we got in the entire series. Now, with Warhammer 3, here's some of the problems with sieges. First off, let's talk about the walls. When you're defending in a siege, it's kind of pointless to hold the walls. The reason is that an attacker with range units in particular can just mass their range units on a section of the wall, and it's practically impossible to defeat those kind of range units unless you have artillery, which many factions don't until a higher level, and it's really the early game where the meat of a campaign is played. In any Total War game, this is not just a situation in Warhammer 3. In any Total War game, it's the early game, like the first 40 turns or so, where the most important decisions of a campaign are made. So you end up in a situation where it's very easy for any attacker to break the walls. It's very hard for any defender to hold onto those walls. It is not a great balancing situation. It used to be different in Warhammer 2, where defending units on wall would take very little damage from range units. Now, the reason I imagine Creative Assembly changed this is because there are certain range-centric factions, and they wanted to allow those kind of factions the ability to win these kind of sieges. But that's really a band-aid to a bigger problem, that certain factions are just not designed very well on the campaign map to deal with the issues of the campaign. That is certainly an issue in itself, and something Creative Assembly should have improved, but not in this way. The second problem with sieges is how the AI handles them. So the AI will not mass their entire army on one particular section of the walls. This does prevent them from being wiped out from range, but it does make for a really dull and annoying situation where you're just fighting one unit at a time. Even if you have a melee-centric army, it is a joke to win sieges if you're, say, Khorne or Warriors of Chaos or even Greenskins, because you just throw your guys through a gate, and because there's no concentration of enemies trying to stop you most of the time, you will end up annihilating them in a straight-up fight. That's the vast majority of cases that happen in sieges. Then, Creative Assembly made the situation far worse in sieges in Warhammer 3, because while they did vastly improve the settlement layout, and that is certainly something that they should get credit for and is appreciated, the problem is they added those buildable towers and blockades, which are really annoying. Now, the towers are not really that relevant. You can easily deal with them, except you can abuse them if you're a defender. Like, it gets ridiculous where the best defensive strategy in the game is to go to 1 or 2 victory points, hold up with your entire army there, build a bunch of towers, and just force enemy choke points and annihilate them, especially because the AI is going to try and attack on multiple sides of a siege, and it's not going to work so well for them because those units will be arriving at different times at the final point. It is the way to inflict maximum casualties. Or hold the walls a bit so the wall towers do some damage, then withdraw, go back in the inner settlement, use your towers to do a lot of damage. Now, the annoying thing with the blockades is that it makes a pathfinding situation that is already pretty terrible, and it makes the situation for the AI, which can't really handle these blockades, far worse than it should be. Now, there is a mod that disables this, but even so, between the AI, its tactics, the layout of these settlements, or rather the wall situation of these settlements, and the various balancing aspects of the game, it makes sieges an utter nightmare. And it doesn't even stop there. Like, if you're playing certain races get much better towers than others. So there's a significant imbalance that gets created with that. Like, most of the time, I try and avoid playing defensive sieges because I know I will be at the severe disadvantage. Unless I'm playing High Elves or Dark Elves because they got incredible towers. Like, I've wiped out entire fucking armies with the tier 3 settlement because that's when you get really great towers. Like, I've wiped out entire armies with defensive towers by abusing those kind of towers and abusing the AI behavior. Like, the AI is really stupid. It is really stupid. It's taking a situation where it should absolutely annihilate you, and it does many times. Like, a garrison can't stop a sieging army. Now, some people talk, oh, there needs to be stronger garrisons. I really don't think that's a solution. I think it would just make the overall campaign situation far worse, and it would create its own balance. So I understand the changes that Creative Assembly made, but they're trying to fix an issue, and while they kind of fix the issue of imbalance, like some races really being horrible in sieges, which push those, if you're playing those kind of races, towards building auto-resolve armies so you can just auto-resolve these sieges, while that is something they were trying to fix, the way they ended up fixing it, like with the tower defense minigame, ended up making the overall situation far worse. It is different than what we had before, and I guess the previous situation was fixed, but they created new problems with respect to these battles. And it is a problem, especially because you'll fight a lot of sieges in a campaign. Now, the fourth issue is regards to the racial balance, which doesn't really exist. Now, perhaps expecting perfect racial balance in a game with this many races, this many legendary lords, is perhaps a tall order, even for Creative Assembly, though at some point you kind of stop running out of excuses for them. The problem with the racial imbalance situation is that it's not that it's not perfect. Like, we're not talking here like, small issues or where one race is slightly better than another. No. We're talking here situations where certain races are substantially better than others, and they will steamroll the campaign map. Kislev, for instance, has a far more limited economic potential than, say, the Dark Elves. The Dark Elves end up dominating the map. The High Elves end up dominating the map. Greenskins. There are some really powerful races. Some races that are mediocre. Some races that are just plain fucking terrible. There are some races which struggle to get access to even basic units that other races start with. That's the kind of racial imbalance that you have in a campaign. Like, look at the dwarves, for instance. Okay, the dwarves can have one powerful army, but good luck maintaining more than one powerful army in a campaign. I can tell you, it takes a lot. And even if you get the second army, you're gonna struggle dealing with foes that can throw 3 armies in one particular battle on one front, and you may be fighting on multiple fronts at the same time. That's the kind of problem. This is the reason why, say, for instance, if we're playing Greenskins, the Greenskins are the unstoppable green tide on a campaign map, because not only can the Greenskins maintain a lot of armies, individual armies, but they also get the WA mechanic, which doubles the size of those armies. And if you're playing Greenskins, well, look at it from this perspective. You can recruit a bunch of nasty Skulkers and Goblin Archers to annihilate everything in your path, but the problem with those units is they're kind of squishy. They're glass cannon units. But then you got the WA army, which is like, okay, we'll just soak up the damage. So you send in your Orc boys, send in your goblins, disposable goblin spearmen of a WA army, soak up the damage while your damage dealers annihilate everything in your path. It is incredibly hard to lose in a situation like that. You can go up against endgame armies of certain races and win in the early game. That is absurdly broken. With the exception like the Chaos Dwarves, I think the only race that's kind of decently balanced is like the Chaos Dwarves, because yes, they have a lot of power, but they also have a lot of vulnerabilities, because you need to build a very powerful economy to actually unlock their powerful units, and early on their Hobgoblins are just not necessarily that great units to deal with the myriad of foes. And also they have limited armies because they won't get a ton of gold to recruit a lot of armies early on. Later on, obviously it becomes much better, sure. But that's the thing that I'm talking about here. It becomes better later on, but you have to work for it. Whereas with other races, you can just steamroll from turn 1. Then there are races which never become better, which have the same kind of situation in the end game that they start with, like the dwarves, because the dwarf army, quarrelers, grudge throwers, never really changes from that fundamental level, and they'll always have a limited economy. So you're limited in how much you can afford. That's the problem that exists in this game. And it creates situations on the campaign map where some factions are a cakewalk to deal with. Like the entire empire is just a cakewalk to deal with. Like if you're playing any decent kind of race, and not even a top tier race like greenskins, dark elves, high elves, warriors, scouts, but no, you can play mediocre races and annihilate the empire with ease, just because the empire doesn't have anything good to throw against you until they get to like tier 3 at a minimum. And that is a problem when you're up against, again, say the greenskins, which have decent tier 1 units, great tier 2 units, and at tier 3, at tier 3, the greenskins versus Empire, it's not even a fucking contest. It's not even in the same universe, let alone the fact that greenskins will vastly outnumber the Empire. That is some of the problems that you do have with regards to Warhammer 3. Now, this has always been the case in the Warhammer games, and honestly always been the case in Total War, but I do think it's getting to the point of ridiculousness. It's worsened by Creative Assembly's handling of patches, bug fixes, and DLCs. And that brings me to the final issue. Creative Assembly's policies in terms of DLC, in terms of bug fixes, in terms of improvements, are ruining the game. Now, this following statement may surprise you, but I think Warhammer 3 actually is the best Total War game that's ever come out. I know, shocking considering all the problems I've talked about, but it has the most quality of life features, it runs the best in a lot of ways, it actually has the best AI. Yeah, I know, it's crazy to think about so many problems this game has, and to realize playing other Total War games that, yeah, it's still a lot better in a lot of ways. But the problem is, Creative Assembly, the way they've been treating this game, they haven't been treating this like a top-of-the-line product that they need to improve to maintain relevance, maintain their audience, grow their audience, which they very well could. No, instead they've been looking at it as a money-milking machine that they've been using for all it's worth while they pour $100 million down the toilet with something like hyenas. And that's really infuriating. It is not acceptable from my perspective that we have something like a blood pack anymore. It is not acceptable that we wait for months for simple bug fixes from a company on issues that modders can fix in a matter of hours or days. It is not acceptable when you hear X, Y, and Z excuse from this company. You know, this is the thing that has changed right now recently. Some people say, oh, Warhammer 3 is a great game. Yes, it is. We wouldn't be talking about it if it didn't have greatness at its core. We wouldn't care as much about it if it didn't have potential. But it does. That's the infuriating aspect with it. That the way Creative Assembly has treated everything, it has been handled far worse than Warhammer 2. Like Warhammer 2, they really achieved a high level of quality that they didn't have before. And a lot of us, like, we expected that with Warhammer 3, they would continue down that path. No, instead, the way they handled things was just looking at that as a cash cow to be milked for all it's worth. And that's the infuriating aspect. Bug fixes need to be released earlier. There's a lot of discussion that's been happening recently about technical debt. And while I can understand that there are certainly issues with respect to that, with the engine limitations, etc., I do not find it as a justifiable excuse when I've seen modders for months and months fix issues easily. When a single person can do a job that the entire AAA developer can't do in months, then that's not an issue with your engine or your technical problems. Now, of course, the way modders fix issues may create other issues, etc., etc. That is very true, but it is irrelevant with respect to what has been happening with Creative Assembly and the way they've treated this entire situation. I do not believe racial improvements should be tied to a fucking DLC to begin with. Not in the sense of minor fixes. Like, I cannot accept the idea like, you know, something like fixing Kislev should not take a DLC. Or a DLC release, rather, because a lot of the stuff gets released for free, even for people that don't own the DLC. But I do not think that they should be tied with that. I do not, like, when we're talking about, like, bugs or glitches or economic fixes or, say, a supporter system fix, which they didn't implement in Shadows of Change, or casualty replenishment, or etc., etc. That is no longer acceptable from my perspective, and that's something that really needs to change with Creative Assembly. Will it change? That's really the big question right now. What will Creative Assembly do at the moment? Now, some people will say, well, they're just going to double down, and it does seem in a lot of ways that they are moving in that particular direction of doubling down instead of fixing these issues, of not changing really in a fundamental way the company works. But I guess we'll have to wait and see. And just to end this over here, while I certainly do not in any way appreciate what someone like Voland, I do not appreciate that in any way. I dislike a lot of things about that guy. The way Creative Assembly has been handling that aspect is honestly pretty telling about like their company policy. Like, we're looking at the company who's reacting to leaks, and I've never seen a game developer do something like what Creative Assembly or Sega have been doing right now, where like they're issuing defamation claims, they're doing copyright strikes. Geez, maybe Total Biscuit was right all along so many years ago when he boycotted Sega because they issued copyright strikes on his channel. He wasn't even talking negatively about anything Sega was doing, by the way. Sega only did it because he had a bunch of videos on older games and they were launching a new game in a series, and they wanted to remove his content from YouTube to make their videos for a new game to rise to the top. Always remember that that's the kind of company Sega can be. And as for CA, well, I think we've seen a lot of what's been happening with content creators. Though I will have to say this, their content creation program is still, in a lot of ways, the best content creation program out there. And I'm not saying this in the sense, oh, if you kiss their ass, they're going to give you a lot of stuff. No, I'm talking about communication, access, just openness. Because if you think Creative Assembly is bad with this, you haven't seen how other companies handle this. Like, there are some companies that do it pretty well. There are many companies that do it worse. Anyway, that's all I had to say. Christine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.